notion, because we don't stop and think about what it means. The human brain takes at least 20 years to fully develop. That's the longest by far of any animal. The closest, more advanced non-human primates is 4 years. For us, it's 20 years. And during that time period, our brain is evolving and changing. And this enables it to optimally adapt itself to the environment, to be prepared to actually overcome and solve complex issues. And that also explains why ultimately the human brain is the most complex organ that we know of. The genes actually are involved very precisely at specific time sequences in that development. So, and ultimately will determine how your brain functions and how your brain reacts to the environment. And one of the findings that I find actually extraordinary, fascinating, is the notion that genes, for example, are going to determine the way that you respond to the environment. Many of the genes that have been associated with mental illness. So, for example, a gene for the dopamine D4 receptor. If you have the variant, the rare variant, you're more vulnerable to several diseases if you are in an adverse environment. But if you have that same variant in an enriched environment, you do better than those that do not have it. And this interaction, direct interaction with the environment and your genetics has opened up the door to make us recognize that even if you have a genetic vulnerability, it doesn't mean that you are predestined, because the environment has to intervene in between.
But once, for example, someone becomes addicted to cocaine, let's say, or to just about any addictive substance, the brain changes, and the brain becomes different in its architecture. I mean, this is pretty much what your data has shown, what your research has shown. So the addiction itself could be almost labeled, and I think it has been labeled from your studies, a brain disease.
Yeah, no, definitely. In brain imaging studies have shown that addiction, that repeated administration of drugs actually changes the brain in ways that enable us to understand some of the behavioral disruptions. And in animal models also, there's been a lot of advances actually identifying the molecules, the proteins that are responsible for those physical changes that are triggered by exposure to drugs. And the insight that they have given us is that drugs basically utilize the same machinery that we use to learn for learning. And what they do is that they strengthen the connection between neurons in such a way that those neurons will have preference. And these are neurons and connections that relate to the way that we respond to rewards and motivation. So this is, again, the brain is physically changed by drugs, and that led us to the statement that it's a disease of the brain. It's a chronic disease because the changes produced by drugs persist months, even years after you stop taking them. But I also think that it's important, and this is something that has evolved in my brain more recently. When we speak about a disease of the brain, I actually sometimes sort of started to think, what do we mean? And the thought came to me one day when I was, again, running, because I get all of these thoughts when I run.
The endorphins.
Yeah, I think it's good for your brain. Very good. It activates all of my dopamine system. And the dopamine system is actually important for reward. So I was running, and it said to me, oh my God, I'm just sort of saying that addiction is a disease of the brain. And I said, imagine if I had a patient with diabetes, and he asked me what do I have, and I said, you have a chronic disease of the pancreas. That doesn't really tell us much. So what it has challenged me is to actually ask the question, well, what does it mean? What does it mean as a disease of the brain? I mean, after all, Parkinson's disease is a disease of the brain, Alzheimer's disease is a disease of the brain, schizophrenia is a disease of the brain. So, but the brain is this extraordinary complex territory. So, what does it really mean? And that's what I've been trying to, of course, as a...
What does it mean particularly, if I may, in terms of free will? I mean, you know, many people still believe there's this great stigma with addiction that someone should be able to overcome their addiction. If you say it's a disease, does that imply somehow that one's autonomy is so compromised that it's almost virtually impossible for them to overcome the addiction? Because many people use that as an excuse. It's my disease. I got in a car accident, I was drunk, but I'm an alcoholic, so it's my disease. So if you say it's a brain disease to be addicted, where does, frankly, autonomy and free will come into play?
Well, that is exactly why I was so attracted to first start to study substances of abuse and addiction, because of the notion of where does autonomy and free will stand in the brain. And my perspective was that if you study an illness and you compare that changes in the brain that occur with that disease with those of a normal person, you can start to understand the neurocircuitry that's responsible for that particular process you're interested. And of course, in the process of free will, at the essence of addiction, there's the loss of the capacity to exert free will as it relates to drug-taking behaviors. It's basically, and when you say, well, what is free will? Well, free will is, we have free will to a certain extent, that there are many of our behaviors that in a way are very much hardwired. We cannot stop breathing if we want to, no matter what. And there are other behaviors that even if you say consciously, if you're going to be touching something that's very hot, you will remove your finger immediately without having to intervene cognitively as someone that is directing your actions. And in addiction, something that happens is akin to that. You transform a behavior where you actually have the capacity to analyze it and regulate it and control it into that automatic behavior. And I've actually seen some of my patients describe that. They've gone to a rehabilitation program and they said to me, you know, doctor, I didn't even realize when I left the hospital before actually even realizing I already was smoking the drug. So it's almost like an automatic behavior that had eluded their frontal cognitive conscious capacity, just like automatic behaviors do.
Would that be true in other forms of, you think about, we're talking about drug addiction, but there are some people who find themselves obese because they can't control their will when it comes to what they want to eat. There's a piece of pie in the refrigerator, and they can't say, I'm not going to have that piece of pie, or in fact, people talk about gambling addictions and shopping addictions and this whole range of things that supposedly have to do with compulsive behavior that can't be controlled through autonomy.
Yeah, no, and I was smiling because I actually sort of feel that I fall into that category with chocolates. I can be a compulsive chocolate.
And that's dark chocolate.
It has to be dark chocolate, otherwise it's not salient to my brain. But the reality we know now is that addiction, like any other diseases, has severity. And so we all, and I certainly do confess, we all have certain moments where we're more vulnerable and we lose control to a certain extent. And when it comes to food, I do lose control with chocolate. It's true, it's not just making it up, I like it. And then I repent about eating so much chocolate. So the issue becomes when it starts to actually interfere and produce harm to you. So when that loss of control becomes very regular. So I lose control when I'm very, very tired, when I'm very, very bored, when the temptations are just incredible. But most of the time I resist it. Whereas there are people that for either genetic or adverse environmental situations, that pattern becomes regular, and then it starts to affect their health. And you see it with food. And we've been studying actually morbidly obese individuals using imaging technologies that we have applied for studying drug addiction to try to understand actually whether there are similarities, where there are similarities and differences between the loss of control that you see in people that are addicted and the loss of control that you see in morbidly obese individuals. So, and initially the whole field was very skeptical. The field of endocrinology and obesity was very, very skeptical because they had concentrated on obesity as an endocrinological disorder. But as the data started to emerge, both from the studies on addiction as well and also obesity, what became apparent is that a lot of the effects of drugs and the disruption that occurs with addiction are basically very much driven by the fact that drugs hijack that system that regulates our motivation to eat and actually is crucial for survival. Now, this has led, for example, to now we know that food is more complex because what regulates our food intake is not just the pleasurable components of food, but many peripheral signals that are basically measuring the content of glucose, the content of fat in your body, and certain nutrients. That does not happen with drugs. Drugs are mainly driven by reward. But the reality is that in our society, where food is so widely available, the main reason that underlies why people overeat is because it's a rewarding stimulant. So when you look at the data is emerging as this tremendous interplay of the circuits that are affected by food being the circuits that are disrupted by drugs. And so even some of these peripheral signals of food, of sugar and fat, are actually modifying the response of the reward centers of the brain to drugs. So the overlap is even at that level. So for example, leptin influences whether you perceive alcohol as rewarding or not.
So where does pleasure come into this, particularly when addictions, as you indicated earlier, can be so onerous to the spirit and make people want to give up what they're addicted to, at least in some part of their brain?
You know, I'm just actually touching a thought that in my brain. So another thought that I've always been obsessed about is, why is it that we all, as a lay public and even in the healthcare system, have had such a difficulty understanding addiction as a disease of the brain, whereas we don't have any problem understanding Alzheimer's as a disease of the brain or Parkinson's as a disease of the brain? And one of the thoughts that emerges in my brain is that in the instances of Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, nobody would question or put forward the hypothesis that these people are choosing to forget or not to move. But in the case of the drugs, because the consumption is associated with reward and pleasure, therefore, people are interpreting this is the reason why people are taking them. But pleasure is actually, first of all, it's a complex construct. What is it that we call pleasure? Tremendously variable. We put a lot of things into that term. It also has degrees. It also varies as a function of our context. Drugs are initially pleasurable to someone that takes them, and that's why people take them, because they feel good and you like to feel good. Your brain is hardwired to respond to rewarding, to pleasurable stimuli. If you weren't, you wouldn't survive. But when people become addicted, what's interesting, and we've been doing studies on this and others too, is that the brain perceives them, and the signals, the chemical signals that are responsible for that rewarding, pleasurable responses are markedly attenuated in people that are addicted. It's almost counterintuitive, because you would say, if the signals are so weakened, why would they even bother? And that is at the essence of addiction, that the person that's addicted, contrary to what was believed for many, many years, respond to the actual consumption of the drug much less than a person that is not addicted. But what has happened in their brain, which is so malignant, is that any reward activates this dopamine system. And when this dopamine system is activated, then that generates a memory. And in fact, not just rewards, but any stimuli that's very salient activates dopamine, and that generates a memory. And these memories are the ones that I was telling you that strengthen the connections. And what it does, it's exactly what Pavlov had described so many years ago, that when you are actually getting a reward, in this case, the meat for the dogs, but he was very clever and he was giving them the meat with a sound, the brain learns to associate the sound with a prediction that a reward is going to be delivered. And what scientists now have found was those, which Pavlov called them conditioned cues. And now scientists have actually shown that those conditioning cues start to liberate dopamine by themselves. So normally it's the drugs that liberate dopamine. Well, with repeated administration, the cues liberate the dopamine. And then that liberation of the dopamine, that signaling of dopamine, is what activates the motivation drive circuitry in your brain. So that when dopamine goes up, the motivation for you is to try to consume that reward which you are anticipating. And this is exactly what goes wrong in the person that's addicted. They've been conditioned in such a way that the stimuli now automatically liberate dopamine and drive their behavior, intense behavior, to go and consume the drug even though the drug itself.
And that's the whole process. I mean, you talk about Pavlov, even before, let's say, I'm going to shoot up if I'm a heroin addict, just the thought about getting the heroin and getting it in my hand, getting the needle in my hand, all of that releases dopamine. And then the dopamine is really released in a much more grand scale once the drug gets into the system. But the whole process has to be repeated. It's almost like compulsive repetition in a way, isn't it?
It is a compulsion repetition, and you wonder then why does it emerge like this, that actually normally when dopamine goes up with a cue, and the magnitude of that increase in animal models predicts how hard the animal is going to work in order to get the reward. Think about it. The magnitude of the dopamine increase by the cue will predict how much the animal is going to work for it. And this is actually, in the case of addiction, what happens is you're getting this massive increase in dopamine that drives the addict to want to take the drug. But different from natural rewards, when you are an animal, very hungry, finds the cue of a smell, for example, of food, that liberates dopamine, that drives you to want to eat it. Once you eat it, it's no longer interesting. It loses its value. In the case of drugs, that doesn't happen, because by their pharmacological effects, their chemical effects, they directly activate dopamine cell, the dopamine system. So you do not attenuate those responses, and that's why you can get into these repetitive behaviors when you are taking drugs that are much harder to achieve with food.
But when we're talking about drugs, we're talking about such a range of drugs. I mean, in fact, I know, in addition to dark chocolate, one of your obsessions is the public health system and some of the things that have gone wrong in it. And I hope we can talk about that, particularly the stigma of addiction, but also the sense that there are so many prescriptive drugs now. There are more people hooked on Oxycontin and more people hooked on various prescription drugs than there are on what we think of as the illegal drugs. And more people obviously hooked on alcohol. I think people are hooked on marijuana too, cannabis. So do you see a different gradation, a different kind of hierarchical scale, or whatever you want to call it, with respect to different drugs and different substances? Can you actually chart that and map that in terms of the brain imagery?
We've actually been imaging people that are addicted to various classes of drugs, legal like alcohol and nicotine, and illegal like methamphetamine, cocaine, and marijuana. But what I can tell you is that each drug has its own pharmacological effects. But when you are studying people addicted to these drugs, the changes in the brain circuitry are very similar. And this, in a way, is not surprising, because if you look at it in terms of the presentation, it actually doesn't really matter whether you're an alcoholic or a heroin abuser. The drive is the loss of control over the intake of the drug and the compulsive pattern and consumption of huge quantities of drugs. That's at the essence of addiction. And whether it is addiction to alcohol, as I say, or heroin, it doesn't really matter. Those drugs are doing this to the brain. The question is, why do some people prefer one drug versus the other? And why certainly there are genes that are making you vulnerable to this addiction to a wide variety of drugs or stimuli, because you can actually generate also abnormal compulsive patterns of food intake, as you were saying, or sexual behaviors or gambling. But there are also genes that make you vulnerable to specific types of addiction, like, for example, heroin or alcohol. And so there are a lot of similarities, but there are also differences.